Okay, now I would like to introduce Dr. Richard Clayton and John Kristoff, who will be presenting Assessing the Aftermath, Evaluating the Effects of a Global DDoS-for-Hire Service Takedown on the DDoS Threat Landscape. Dr. Clayton works in the Cambridge Cybercrime Center in the Computer Laboratory at the University of Cambridge and joins us remotely today. Joining us on stage, John is a PhD candidate in computer science at the University of Illinois, Chicago, a principal analyst at NETSCOUT, and member of the NANOG program committee. It's a pleasure to have them speaking with us today. Welcome, Dr. Clayton and John.
Very much. Hello, Richard. So Richard's going to do the first half of this presentation, and I'm going to, I believe, control the slides for you if I'm not mistaken. You just tell me when to move forward, Richard.
Okay, let's have the next slide. Okay, right. If you had gone on the internet in the middle of December and gone to one of 49 different domain names, you will have seen this fine splash page, which said that the domain name had been seized by the FBI. And if you clicked on that, then you'll have gone to the link which is there, which would have gone to an explanatory page up in Anchorage, Alaska, run by the FBI, which explained that doing denial of service attacks is illegal, running booters, these websites, is illegal. And I draw your attention before we move on from this slide to the fact that there are quite a number of logos on it, and not just the logo of the FBI, but also various other foreign to you in the US, police forces as well. Next slide, please. So let's get everybody on the same page. We're talking about DDoS-for-hire services, which are usually called booters. They tend to call themselves stressors because they're trying to leverage the fact that there are a few legal services for stress testing your network in order to make sure that you can cope with a denial of service attack. However, the websites that we're talking about allow anybody to attack anything, and therefore they are not stressors in the legal sense. They are illegal. They're called booters because a major use of these sites is to boot people out of online games. And many of the users of these booters are kids at high school who are basically cheating at their online game. Because if you can take the opposition's best player out, then you can win your capture the flag exercise. If you're losing, you can take down the server. Or for that matter, if you've got a maths test tomorrow, you can take out your high school. And these sites are distinctly affordable. For $20, you can get as many denial of service attacks as you wish for the next month. The attacks are not extremely large. They're generally in the 5 to 10 gig region, which is not going to take out Google, but it will take out a home connection. It will take out your average high school. It will take out unprotected game servers. And the attacks tend to be 5 to 10 minutes, but there's nothing to stop you at the end of the 10 minutes pushing the button again and doing another attack on the same target. These booters offer a range of different attack types. A lot of them offer UDP amplified reflected attacks. This is DNS, NTP, LDAP, etc., where their servers send out a small packet to a misconfigured device, and that device sends a large packet or a large series of packets to the target, and therefore you get amplification. And because you've reflected the traffic, it's a little bit harder to block, and it's difficult to establish where the actual real source of the traffic was. Besides that, they will tend to do SYN and ACK attacks, sometimes spoofed, sometimes not, and some of them will offer layer 7 attacks, so they'll actually make an HTTP or even an HTTPS connection and then issue commands which work at that layer of the stack, so that you can, if your website is not well configured, then having large numbers of GET commands for a particularly large PDF or whatever can cause a denial of service in that way. Now, operating a booter is illegal in most jurisdictions, and people have actually gone to jail in the US, in the UK, and Netherlands, etc. So there's no question whatsoever that operating one of these booters and allowing anybody to attack anything is illegal. What's more, using the booter is also illegal, though I'm not aware of anybody who's ever been sent to jail for simply using a booter. Mainly, as I said, a lot of the people who use these booters are high school kids, and it's not generally seen to be in the public interest to send high school kids to jail. And law enforcement tends not to bother with the users because what they're interested in generally is harm prevention. And therefore, if you take out the booter and then spend your resources chasing after other operators of booters, or indeed other cyber criminals more generally, then that's a much more useful use of your time than going after high school kids who just didn't want to do a maths test. Next slide. So law enforcement down the years have done a number of attacks, actions, it's attacks from the booter's point of view, but law enforcement actions against booters and stressors. So back in 2016, the Lizard stressor denial of service site was taken down. That was actually operating a botnet on the back end, and the operators of the botnet were arrested. In April 2018, the Dutch and the UK police took down webstressor.org, which at the time was the biggest booter in the world, and they caused a certain amount of disruption to the booter landscape for several weeks, because it turned out that a number of other booters were using WebStressor as a back end. So they weren't actually doing their own attacks. They were just using an API on WebStressor. So when the WebStressor went out of business, then the other booters had no ability to do attacks for a little while. And then in December 2018, the FBI seized 15 domain names, which took, it says on the slide, 8 booters offline. It was really about 7.5, because one of them had 2 domain names, and through an oversight, only one of the domain names was seized. So depending which domain name you used to access the booter, it was either offline or it wasn't. And 3 people at that point were arrested. 2 of them copped a plea. One of them was foolish enough, I think, to opt to go to trial. That trial concluded last September, and he's currently serving time in a federal prison. In December 2022, we have the action which we're talking about today, where the FBI seized 49 domain names, which took 54 booters out of commission immediately. At that time, there were 108 booters running, according to my measurements, and the FBI also announced the arrests of 6 people who've been operating these booters. Now, previously, when law enforcement have gone after booters, they'd generally gone for the biggest one in the world, or alternatively, the most advertised ones in the world. What was different about the December 2022 action is that what was done was evidence-based. It was based on data which was supplied by me through the Cambridge Cybercrime Centre, which ensured that what we went after were not just the one biggest booter in the world, but the 49 biggest booters in the world. And the fact that I can say with some confidence that there were 108 booters is because every week I spend about half a day visiting every booter which I know of, keeping track of which ones are operating, which ones have gone down, which ones have got new names, and so forth. So basically, this action was data-oriented and highly targeted. Also, we're not really going to talk about this much today, but the emphasis was on disruption. So besides the actual seizure of the domain names and the announcement of the arrests, there's also been a fairly high-profile advertising campaign. If you go and search for booter on Google, then you will see ads run by the Dutch and the UK police, which say booting is illegal. And there is good academic evidence from some work we did a few years back that if you're actually searching for a booter and you see an advert that says it's illegal, then you are slightly less likely to actually go and purchase the denial of service which you had in mind. We have good data which shows that this caused demand suppression for a 6-month period, whilst the NCA, the National Crime Agency in the UK, were running these adverts back in 2018, and they have been carrying on doing this ever since because it is basically disruptive harm reduction and so forth. Also, the Dutch police went on to various of their chat channels where the booter people went and explained to people that booters had been seized and that databases had been seized from booters, and that therefore there might well be some follow-up action against some of the users of the booters. Next slide, please. Now, when I visit these booters, about 70% of them helpfully publish attack numbers. They publish data about how many servers they have, how many, that's traffic generating servers, how many users they have, and how many attacks they have done in their lifetimes. Why do they do this? Well, they're basically advertising because if that's a big number, you're going to think, well, other people have successfully used this booter. It must be successful. It's been in the market a long time. I will buy something here as well. Yes, this is self-reported data. Yes, indeed, some of the booters cheat and they inflate their figures. But if you collect the data every week, then this is pretty bloody obvious to you when they've chucked an extra 250,000 attacks into their totals, because suddenly for 1 week they appear to have been the biggest booter in the world, whereas I know very well that they're the 30th biggest booter in the world, and therefore they've obviously inflated their numbers. So it's possible to detect when they are cheating. And also, we've written papers on this, and one of my co-authors is a very fine statistician, and he did a great deal of work checking whether or not the numbers looked natural. There are various statistical tests you can do on sets of numbers which show whether or not they've been invented by people or whether or not they come from the natural world, and we conclude that in almost every case that the numbers are in fact valid. So on the 12th of December, on the Monday, before the FBI action took place later that week from the Wednesday onwards, these were the biggest booters in the world. And all of those booters were part of the 49 which were taken down, with 2 exceptions, which are quite illustrative. Number 9 wasn't taken down because it didn't actually work. We tested it several times, bought a service on there, attempted to do a denial of service attack on our very own victim machine, and nothing happened. No traffic turned up. So Though this is very wicked of the booter, it's a matter for the Federal Trade Commission, not for the FBI. So under the FBI's terms of engagement here, we were not in a position to seize that domain name. And number 11 wasn't seized because it was completely outside the jurisdiction. The legal basis on which these domain names were seized was that they were the people who were operating these booters had committed money laundering offences, because under US statute, it is a money laundering offence if you cause money to go across the US border in furtherance of an illegal activity. And as mentioned, running a booter is illegal, and therefore if you buy hosting in the US or you buy a domain name within the US and it is obvious that you are not in the US, and the easiest way of this is if your hosting is outside the US and your domain name you have purchased is inside the US, then money must have flowed across the US border in one direction or the other. So we don't actually mind where you are. Money's crossed the US border, that's a money laundering offence, and therefore your domain name can be seized because it's being used in furtherance of an illegal activity. However, number 11 there bought their hosting outside the US and bought their domain name outside the US, and therefore the FBI on this occasion couldn't touch them. However, if you recall, on that splash page I showed you earlier, there are quite a number of logos of other police forces, and one of those police forces is in fact this particular booter is within the jurisdiction of that particular police force. So watch this space because something is going to happen to them real soon now. Next slide, please. You'll probably not be surprised to learn that a number of the booters came back again with brand new domain names. This was expected. The good news was half of them gave up. If you look at the what this is the top 10, the biggest booters, or 14 in fact, the biggest booters in the world on the 26th of December. That's 2 weeks after the previous chart and 10 days after the FBI action started. And you can see that the chart is dominated by booters which have come back again, and therefore these are new. It's exactly the same booter, they just have a new domain name. But if you look at the figures, you'll see that across the board, there is half the activity that there was before. There are two reasons for this, one of which is that people read all the press articles and decided that perhaps they wouldn't do any booting over Christmas after all. And the other possibility is they just couldn't find their favorite booter because it'd gone to a new domain name. So unless they had subscribed to the chat channel on Telegram or whatever, then they couldn't actually find where the booter had gone to. And therefore they'd have to find another $20 in order to find another booter. And of course, if they went and did a search on Google, then they saw the adverts from the police forces telling them it was illegal. So we see demand suppression across the board here. So half the booters disappear, most of the big ones come back again, but the amount of number of attacks which they're doing is down by about 50%. And so now we pass over to John.
Thank you, Richard. Before I get started in my piece, I actually want to take a quick poll of those here in attendance. Before you were aware of this presentation, and perhaps before Richard just told you about this event in December 15th, this takedown event, how many of you were aware that this had actually happened, by show of hands? So for Richard's benefit and others who might not be able to see, not a lot, probably maybe 15, 20 people out of, so maybe about 10% of the people in this room. And of those of you who are aware of this event, presumably those of you who also operate some sort of network infrastructure, by show of hands, how many of you were able to detect that something had changed, saw fewer DDoS attacks or traffic patterns, whatnot. 3, 4, 5 people. So not very many. I'm not too surprised by that. But I think that's interesting and perhaps telling. It'll actually speak a little bit to my portion here. So Richard did all the hard work, truly. And his measurement was looking at specifically booters and stressors in this so-called DDoS-for-hire service. NETSCOUT and Acer, the group that I'm in, we wanted then to, well, what can we see from our attack alert data from our deployments for the customers who share attack alert data with us? Do we see evidence that this happened? Do we see a reduction in the actual attack traffic? So that's what I want to basically show you mostly is some pictures. So here I took, I divided the attack alerts that we see, and this is, you can think of this as a sample, and it's certainly not a representative 100% coverage of the internet DDoS traffic, but it's a portion of what we see. I divided it between TCP and UDP traffic. And I was interested, did we see something happen? And December 15th is this red line right in the middle. And from this graph, you see the TCP in dark blue, and the sort of teal greenish color is UDP. And the dashed lines are just a 7-day average. It's not entirely clear just by breaking it down from these two perspectives, these sort of larger aggregate layer 4 protocols. It looks like maybe something happened, and there was an average decrease that happened throughout the end of the month, and maybe slightly lower, but seems to sort of more or less recovered. So if you didn't know something had happened on December 15th, you might think this is perhaps just normal seasonal traffic, and that would be a reasonable conclusion to make. But if we start to look more at a targeted segment of traffic, for instance, a US eyeball network, a broadband carrier where users are, might be the gamers themselves, and it looks like you see a direct correlation of when the takedown event occurred, and the DDoS attack counts for that network dropped precipitously, and throughout not only the end of December, but all the way into January, have still been a significant reduction by maybe half or more. So perhaps there was a correlation. If we look at a different type of provider, just to maybe to see if it wasn't just that network or that type of network, if we look at a European hosting provider, this might be a provider who's providing the gaming servers, which may also be on the receiving end of some of these types of booter stressor attacks. Again, December 15th, there seems to be a drop in the attack count across our data set here when we look specifically at them. And again, the average, and it remains low all the way through up to the present time. Look at, from another perspective, let's look at what we would classify attacks as either direct path or reflection amplification. So essentially the difference between spoofed and non-spoofed attacks. On this graph, the direct non-spoofed attacks are on the teal up on the top, and the spoofed be in the dark blue. It's a little less clear here that maybe something had happened on December 15th. The average maybe is slightly lower after December 15th, but again, we might attribute that to seasonal trends. So this is not something we would have necessarily spotted if we didn't know something happened on December 15th. We might not have attributed to that takedown event. But if we hone in on a specific type of amplification reflection attack, DNS, for example, here, it almost looks like it's perfectly correlated, where on December 15th, something definitely happened. We've seen peaks and valleys before, but something happened, the average went way down, and has slightly recovered perhaps towards the end of January, but something is different. Is this a seasonal change? Maybe, but if just looking at this graph, we might think that the takedown certainly had an effect here with this type of attack, and even more pronounced perhaps if we look at it from the perspective of NTP. We see, again, on the 15th, almost a perfect correlation here. The average drops to essentially what the halfway mark was before December 15th, and essentially stays there till the present day. So there seems to be a cause and effect here. However, this, depending on how you look at the data, we could be deceived. We could mistake the patterns that we see there with something else that may be going on. So I wanted to take a look at what's the difference between this current period, the last 3 months, and a year prior? Is the distinction, is that December 15th event really the thing that changed our traffic patterns at that time of the year, or not? Now here's where the picture becomes a little bit fuzzier. So again, looking at TCP versus UDP, this was kind of hard to determine at the beginning anyways. There's just such a large aggregate of traffic. The y-axis numbers aren't necessarily the same values on both years, but the shape of the graph essentially is the most important part. I'll make one note here, just it's a interesting footnote to history, is that over the last year or two, the prevalence of TCP versus UDP attacks has essentially switched places, where UDP and reflection amplification attacks always seem to be the more common type of attack. More recently, it's become direct path TCP-based attacks. And that's what the change in the graph shows in the aggregate. But if we look at the December 15th event, is the graph shaped entirely different than from a year ago? And you might be forgiven to say no. In fact, a year ago, there was even perhaps a bigger dip in some part of the traffic. We could sort of try to hone in and zoom in on the picture and pull out different pieces of this, but I wouldn't draw too many conclusions on this graph alone, or these sets of graphs. If we look at the US eyeball network now from the recent period to a year ago, this is a little interesting that the shape of the two graphs between the 2 years are similar, but we do see that there was something that occurred a little bit earlier this last period, perhaps on the 15th. So perhaps there was a cause and effect. I wouldn't necessarily bet my life on it, but it looks like there's maybe something happening here that's different this year. Same thing with the EU hosting provider. Again, if you look at the average line, you can see it's more pronounced, that the difference over the time series between the 2 years. And then looking at DNS amplification and NTP, which will be to follow, trying to compare the two, you see from the prior year, the slope downward around the mid-December period was more gradual a year ago. And in the last 3 months, there was a more sudden drop in the average, and it's more or less stayed about 50%, maybe 50, 25% reduced to what it was prior in the months before. So we wouldn't necessarily write a research paper on graphs like this, but we seem to see some probable cause and effect. If not entirely convinced, we could argue that this is at least some evidence of an effect. Here's the NTP version. The NTP is a little bit more pronounced again. And remember that the attacks that we're showing here is all the attacks that NETSCOUT sees. So there's booter and stressor attacks are just one form of DDoS attacks, right? So we're also considering all the landscape of the entire set of whatever DDoS attacks might exist, whoever runs them, however they're actually conducted. So perhaps, maybe we see a lot more than we realized, or perhaps the amount of traffic that the DDoS stressor attacks that make up at least the data that we see is not as significant as we might have expected. We were expecting to see some really interesting graphs. But another thing that Richard said was that a lot of these attacks that are conducted by booter and stressors, which I think is an interesting point, is they're often very short-lived, 5 minutes, oftentimes just enough to kick someone out of a game. That may not be enough to trigger an alert for our products and our customers. The bandwidth that's consumed may not trigger an alert back to us. It may be a low alert. We don't get low alerts. We get medium and high alerts. So there may be some bias in just our view of the world. So what we would conclude, at least based on the data that we see from NETSCOUT, is there's a probable decrease. I think from Richard's perspective, there's certainly an absolutely measurable conclusive proof that the attacks have decreased. It's a little bit harder, I think, to see it from network traffic, at least in a large aggregate. Those of you the 5 or so of you who raised your hands and said you noticed that something had changed, I'd be very curious to hear more about what you saw on your networks specifically that maybe we can't pull out when we're looking at all of this data. So that's more or less our conclusion when we look at the data. Wrapping up with what Richard said, I think what to keep in mind is that unlike previous events, takedown events, the whack-a-mole types of stuff that some of you in the security community have done before, is this was trying to chop a piece of the tree off, trying to stunt the growth of the attacks, trying to limit them, reduce them down to manageable size, do some dissuasion, persuasion. It mentions some campaigns to encourage those not to participate in this type of activity. So I think that's what you'll notice more and more over time now, is that we're not going to try to eliminate this kind of stuff. It almost seems probably impossible, but try to actually reduce it and disrupt it and discourage it as much as we can. So I think that's what you'll see from us more and more, from us, the community, not us specifically, but folks like Richard and others. So with that, I think we have concluded, and we'll have, I think, plenty of time for questions and answers, if any of you have them. And as I suggested, if anyone can share their perspective, I'd love to hear here at the mic or offline. Thank you very much. Maybe who's manning the virtual questions? I don't know if there's any virtual questions. Go ahead, sir.
Hi there, Justin with Momentum. How do you find the booter network using your observation?
Richard, would you like to answer that?
Well, the booters come in two parts, one of which is the front end, the shop front, where you can actually buy things. Many of those front ends are hidden behind Cloudflare because one of the popular targets of booters is their competition, other booters. So they all go and use Cloudflare to protect themselves. Not all of them, just 90% of them. Cloudflare, of course, a US company, they cooperate with law enforcement, and therefore law enforcement is able to discover where the actual hosting is taking place, and that's often in Europe at well-known hosting companies. The second part of a booter network is the traffic generation servers, and they have to be sited at a hosting company which permits people to spoof traffic. And because there has been a certain amount of community pressure over the last 18 months or so to clamp down on hosting providers who allow their customers to spoof traffic, that is becoming harder and harder for the booter operators to do. And I often see, when I visit these sites, people apologizing for the fact that their layer 3 attacks are not currently working, and it may be several weeks before they come back again, and therefore they encourage everybody to use layer 7 attacks instead. And of course, when attacks are flowing directly from the source to the target, then a clued up target is able to identify the sources of the traffic and then have a word with the originating hosting companies, who, if they are respectable, and some of them are, they will do something about it.
Thank you.
Very much. I'm not seeing anyone else at the mic. So I'll turn over to you, Aaron. Thank you.